A Comedy of Terrors by John Burke. The story conference had been in progress for 3 hours, if you could call it progress. The casting director, who had hoped to be in his girlfriend's bed by 8 o'clock at the latest, realised that the evening was likely to be a long one and that he would be lucky even to get home to his wife before midnight. This made him vindictive. He said something rude about the screenwriter, but the writer had already heard 3 of his best ideas turned down flat, and was sulking anyway. One more insult made little difference. Erwin Hoddick said, "The same rules we've always followed, right? No monsters, no gloomy castles, no mummies, no vampires, right?" "Right," said the assistant producer loyally. "Something psychological. Something creepy happening to the girl. And I want the girl from that picture we ran this morning." The casting director took dour pleasure in saying, "Sorry, Erwin, I checked. She's tied up for 6 months on Clarion's thing about the bubonic plague." Erwin sighed. "So we wait 6 months? The way we're going right now, it'll take that long to get the storyline straightened out." The casting director lit another cigarette. His eyes were smarting from the smoke haze in the room, but he had to do something to stop the frustration tightening into a hard knot inside him. Robbie, the designer, sat back and thought, with self-indulgent detachment, of the best way of showing a boa constrictor crushing the life out of a man. Or perhaps a child would make the audience gasp a bit more. Or a kitten. He would have to do some research to see whether the eyes popped. Might get a nice effect that way. Not that it fitted the current story, insofar as there was a story. Erwin was staring straight at him. "Any ideas, Robbie?" Erwin Hoddick had made his reputation and worked wonders for his bank balance as the creative force in contemporary horror films. At a time when cinema attendances were declining, Erwin had found a way of pulling people in. He showed them things they wouldn't see on television, things they could never have imagined in their wildest dreams or wildest nightmares. Statistics showed that over half the cinema-going audience today was made up of people under 25 years of age, and most of those were probably under 20. Mainly they were kids wanting to get out of the house, wanting to get their girls away from watchful mothers and sniggering younger brothers. He wanting an excuse to put his arm round her. She wanting an excuse for him to put his arm round her. What better than a horror picture to lure them into the semi-darkness? "Give me a scream every 2 minutes, as Erwin put it, and we can't lose." He was breaking away from the crude shocker. Lumbering creatures from the deep or from outer space were dead, box office wise. Erwin's pictures blended sex and creeping fear, jarred by sudden psychological shocks, a touch of nausea, something to provoke an instinctive ugh, and then a shiver of near orgasmic ecstasy. Not that Erwin would have put it in quite such words, but intuitively he knew the ingredients of the most profitable shivers. Erwin had worked in California and then come to Europe in search of cheaper facilities and wonderful backgrounds. He found both. He made a clutch of B pictures in Rome and 2 gothic thrillers in Vienna. Then he discovered England. England, he announced, was spooky. England was really way out. All those crazy old traditions, and those crazy places, and those kooky people. The most celebrated and most gruesome murders had all been committed in England. Any connoisseur of crime knew that. There was something sinister in the air. He liked it. He settled down and did some real work. The last few years had been triumphant, and the triumphs, the real successes, dated from the day he engaged Robbie Senage as designer. After their first picture together, Erwin put Robbie under contract. It became known through the trade, in the way these things do get known, that Robbie was not just a set and costume designer, and not just a special effects man of genius. He thought his every thought in film terms. He saw the whole thing in his mind. From Robbie's ideas came all that was most characteristic in a Hoddick production. A reviewer on one of the Sundays once said that Robbie Senage thought with his eyes. It was never the basic story that counted. Writers were hired merely to string together the grotesqueries which Robbie dreamed up. Robbie produced new frisons, and the writer had simply to devise a surface logic and link in dialogue for the whole sequence. The current writer sank deeper into his chair. He wasn't even trying anymore. "Robbie?" Erwin prompted. "I'm thinking," said Robbie. Erwin said, "Something to do with the mind. Telepathy. Or brainwashing or something. There's a lot of talk about it these days." "It's not visual." "I'm just talking off the top of my head, of course," said Erwin. "But I've got a feeling. The mind. Folks are scared of what goes on in their own minds." "Don't blame them," said the casting director. Erwin swung his swivel chair from left to right, right to left. He gazed up at the ceiling. He said, "What really frightens people? What gets right under their skin?" "Snakes," said the assistant producer. "Most people are scared stiff of snakes. We've used them." "And beetles," thought Robbie. "And spiders we've used too." He smiled at the memory. There had been nothing corny in their spider picture. It had been cumulative, suggestive, quiet, and chilling. At the end it was as terrifying as only a whisper can be. There was never any bombastic uproar in a Hodek production. "Any time I hear the music or the effects on the soundtrack getting loud," Erwin had once proclaimed, "I know somebody's trying to cover over something." And moths, thought Robbie. The lighting and camera work in the moth picture had been out of this world. Sound too. Restrained sound blending perfectly with the visual tension. The flapping, the whirring, the insistence, yes, out of this world. A woman in Llandudno had had a heart attack and died in the cinema. Her husband had tried to sue the company, but had stood no chance against Erwin's lawyers. The publicity had been great. "We've used so many things," said Robbie. "We're running short." They all laughed because they knew this was absurd. But they had certainly devised terror in an awful lot of ways. Claustrophobia. With Ronnie's concept of long slanted walls closing in at the wrong dizzying angles, and the muffled drum beats like heartbeats, and the shadows that rushed out suffocatingly into the very audience. Hypodermics. Funny how people gagged at the sight of the needle entering flesh, and the drawing of blood samples, the blood rising. Mice and rats, vertigo, fear of slimy things, the texture of a human brain oozing out through a hole in the skull, the implication of something sticky and amorphous just off the edge of the screen. Light, darkness and shadow. Obscene shadows. They had exploited every possibility. They had built up an incomparable skill in distorting the commonplace and making it hideous. But there must be more. There were as many fears as there were human beings in the world. Out-of-night sounds and daytime silences. There were still 1,000 terrors to be conjured up. Robbie half closed its eyes and mused, mutely addressed a vast unseen audience. "I'll find a fear for all of you, for each of you, a special one for you, and you, and you. Your secret nightmares. I'll get round to them all in time, and for those who think they don't have nightmares, oh, just wait till I've finished with you." Unexpectedly, Erwin said, "I don't know about you guys, but I'm pooped." He spread his arms wide and yawned. "Let's break it up. Sleep on it, and be back here at 10 tomorrow with something real, huh?" They got up slowly. It was never good policy to seem in a hurry to leave Erwin's office. The casting director stood with his hands in his pockets and stared at the floor as though he might, at this late stage, come up with one sudden splendid notion. Then he braced himself and went reluctantly on to the door. "See you, Erwin. Night." He might just manage half an hour. Robbie adopted a more leisurely pace. Robbie had no need to rush through his pleasures. He was not married, and he had all the time in the world for whatever it pleased him to do. When he got home, he would ask Doreen what her own special horror was. The idea of ever having to work for her living, probably. Robbie lived in a mews in Kensington. His home was neither a cottage nor a house. It was a conglomeration, a solid old stable converted into a garage and now into his workroom, linked with a small house, a studio, and a small paved garden which ran up against a tall thick wall, dividing the whole group from small gardens beyond. Next door was a garage, from which proceeded at times a great deal of hammering and the revving up of engines. Robbie had often been asked if he didn't find the noise distracting, but in fact he liked to experiment with sound, with things to set the teeth on edge, with grating juxtapositions. Besides, the row was often useful in drowning out some of the noises which he himself was producing. This evening he let himself in and strolled into the sitting room. The lights were on, and he expected to find Doreen sprawled on the couch as usual, fingering through magazines as usual, and drinking yet another bottle of coke or another gin and tonic, and abstractedly stroking her left thigh as usual. The room was empty. A book lay open face down on the couch. Doreen had been reading about flagellation and flaying. She liked to pretend that his work for Hodek gave her the creeps, but her tremors were as ambivalent as those of any writhing girl in a cinema audience. In such moods she was very responsive, and he was glad to have her around. Not that he wanted her around all that much longer. Custom had staled her, far from infinite variety. But tonight, thinking of her, he was prepared to enjoy her. As he went towards the black and green bedroom, he conjured up a picture of her, thinking with his eyes, seeing her as vividly and immediately as though she were only a few feet away. Her bright blue eyes pale in a strong light, her fair skin with its delicate surface misleading, because she was tough enough and strong enough. She had led a despairing young cameraman a dance for a couple of years, had been cited in his divorce case, and then had risen in the world to become Robbie Senage's mistress. He saw her so clearly that it came as a surprise to find that she was not there in the bedroom waiting for him. He heard the swift rustle of feet. She was coming along the passage from his workroom, trying to look airy and unconcerned. "Robbie, darling, you're so late," he said. "Where have you been?" "Oh, just wandering about. I was getting so impatient, sweetie, I couldn't sit still." "You've been in my workroom." "Sweetie, let's have a drink." She tried to brush past him. He seized her wrist and forced it round until her clenched fingers opened. She had been clutching a key. He said, "I told you never to go in there." "I was just drifting about. I didn't do any harm. I didn't touch anything." "You were snooping." "You left the key in the door, so—" "I never leave the key in the door. That's a spare one. You got it out of my dressing table." "Well, what if I did?" When she was utterly in the wrong, Doreen always grew venomous and aggressive. "It's high time I saw what you've got hidden away in there. I'm not surprised you keep the door locked. Some of those things. Robbie, you do have a kinky mind, don't you?" He dropped the key into his pocket and half dragged her towards the sitting room. "Never heard of Bluebeard's Castle?" he said. "And what happened to the silly snooping girl who couldn't leave well alone?" "You're hurting me." Doreen shook herself free and collapsed petulantly on the couch. "Some of those things," she said again. "Those hooks, and that awful thing with spikes in the corner." She put both hands on the couch to prop herself up and knocked the book away. "And that book, all that stuff about blood from wounds and beating men to death, and hanging, drawing and quartering them, spelling them out all over the place. Ugh, I mean honestly, can you imagine?" "Yes," said Robbie. He could not merely imagine, he knew the sight, sound and smell of it, every detail. "And flaying a woman alive?" Doreen persisted. "I suppose you know all about that too?" "No," said Robbie thoughtfully. No, that's something I've never tried. Anyway, she thrust her plump, moist lower lip out at him. What about you? What about me? What about you and your own fears? You're so good at frightening other people with all this stuff you swat up. But what about the thing that scares you? Shall I tell you what I know about it? You don't know a thing. You talk in your sleep. She laughed derisively. Unsteadily. That's a nasty dream you keep having, Robbie. Do you ever tell Mr. Hoddick about that one? Be quiet. She looked insufferably pleased. He could have shaken her, wanted to get his hands on her, and his imagination stopped there, for the moment. Doreen's anger drained away into smugness. She got up and walked towards the bedroom, waiting for him to follow. He went slowly after her and watched her as she undressed. She swayed and pirouetted in front of him, silently boasting about her body and about her hold on him. When she was naked, he took the workroom key from his pocket and tossed it a few times in the air. I'll just go and make sure nothing's been disturbed. Robbie, don't be such a fusspot. I swear I didn't touch anything. All the same, he said. He went along the passage and let himself into the converted garage and switched on the light. The anatomical diagrams backdrop to his collection of wooden and iron racks, pincers and various screws. The butcher's hook swayed gently from the ceiling as he crossed the floor. Immediately under the centre light stood the stake with its looped chains and steel manacles. He opened the manacles in readiness and put a leather gag on the nearby bench where he could reach it quickly. Then he called, Doreen! What is it? Come here a minute. I'm not getting out of bed. I thought you told me you hadn't touched anything. That fetched her. She came indignantly along the passage, tugging a dressing gown over her shoulders. As soon as she was in the workroom, he closed the door as he tore the dressing gown from her. She began to laugh as he put his arms around her, thinking that this was something new, something attractively perverse he had thought of. It was not until the manacles clamped on her naked flesh that she tried to scream, and then it was cut short as he crammed the gag between her soft red lips and hard white teeth. He set to work. It was a long process. He was a perfectionist, and he wanted to be absolutely sure of what he was doing. After 20 minutes he began to wonder if the supposed experts of the past had been any good at their job. Without the sharpest implements it would surely have been impossible to work to the required degree of accuracy. One needed the finest scalpel edge and the steadiest hand to remove the top layer of skin without slicing too deep. To get the best effect, it was essential to lay bare a redness which bubbled without smearing too messily. As the garage was not working at this time of night, there was no hammering or revving of engines to drown the noise that Doreen might make. So reluctantly he had to keep her gagged. Not that he really needed the sound of her voice. It wouldn't do for the soundtrack of a Hodek film. Too crude, too raucous and naive. As he drew the blade delicately down, flaying her with loving care, he thought of Cooperin. That was it, some of Coopering's harpsichord music. Steely cobwebs of austere beauty on the soundtrack. When he had finished it was dawn. In the final stages he had taken what he recognised as a childish pride in the rhythmic continuity of the operation, the sort of absurd pleasure one gets from taking the peel off an apple in one regular unbroken curl. For another hour he took colour pictures of his handiwork. When he was quite sure that his mind and his camera had recorded all the essential reference material, he went out and ate a hearty breakfast. Before leaving for Erwin Hoddick's office in Wardour Street, he gave Doreen a drink. She was just conscious enough to accept it, but unable to make any sound other than a long retching groan. In spite of his lack of sleep and the intensity of his concentration during the night, he was in a good mood when the story conference started up again. Flaying alive, he said chirpily, within a few seconds of Erwin settling into his chair and demanding coffee. Maybe you've got something there, said Erwin. Not because he had quite grasped what Robbie had in mind, but because he had learned to trust Robbie's hunches. "A girl," said Robbie, "flayed alive and in agony. Like Hans Andersen's mermaid, every step, every breath is agony. Every breath of wind. She can't bear to be touched, can't bear to wear clothes." "Nice," agreed Irwin. "Hypersensitive, and there needs to be some particular menace." "Piranhas," said the casting director. He too was bright and brisk and cheerful this morning. "She falls into a river, and you know what those dead little fish are like at the smell of blood." "Too quick," said Irwin. "No suspense. All over too damn fast." "Maggots," said the writer gloomily, sure that nobody would pay the slightest attention. "She's buried alive." It had just come to him. Beyond Irwin's shoulder, through the window and through another window on the far side of the street, he saw a girl in a crisp white blouse at a typewriter, laughing and talking to someone else in the room. Such a fresh, eager look about her, such a fresh feel about the whole day. "Buried alive," he said, "and the earth is pressing against her exposed body. Earth, roots, maggots." The idea flourished, sprouted, put forth beautiful buds. What goes on in her mind? Perhaps there's a medium, someone psychically in touch with the girl, reporting on every sensation. She starts living it out, living through it all. Here above the ground, before our very eyes, she becomes possessed by the terror of the girl below the ground, and we know the girl is dead when we see the medium slowly starting to decay, although she's still alive, or something on those lines. "Not before she's carried out a revenge on the girl's killer," contributed Irwin. The writer shifted in his chair and looked sceptical, but the others reacted with a growing delight that one could almost feel. "Playing on people's nerve endings," said Robbie, and he added, "We could call it creep flesh creep." "I like that," said Irwin. "Yes, I'll buy that. Now look, I think we've got something here, the way I see it." They listened for 10 minutes to the way Irwin saw it, and then they all began to contribute. And now it began to work. It made sense. That evening Robbie went home late and jubilant. He hummed to himself as he went into the mews. In a minor key, of course. It was more appropriate. He was fascinated to observe how Doreen's texture had changed and how the colouring had staled and darkened. She was still alive, but he estimated only just. After a drink and a light supper, he set about disposing of what might, he thought wryly, be referred to as his raw material. He wrapped Doreen in some old sacking and loaded her into his car. The texture of the sacking might rasp on her, but the sensation could not last for very long. The road was a familiar one. He had driven along it in darkness several times before. He headed out beyond Slough and down a long gentle slope to the vast dump under the trees. For years now there had been a growing chaos of discarded cars there. It amounted now to 3 or 4 acres of rusted metal, rotten seats and cushions, old tyres, shattered glass, crumpled boxes and cartons. Every now and then someone complained to the local authorities and asked when something was going to be done about this eyesore. It had grown so large and intractable that the authorities seemed unlikely ever to tackle it now. Robbie carried what was left of Doreen into the sombre heart of the metal graveyard. He buried her and pulled some ragged strips of rusted corrugated iron over the newly turned earth. Then he drove home, relaxed and fulfilled, planning new possibilities to suggest to Irwin the next day. His ideas were so successful that at one stage the writer went out of the room to be sick. Robbie had watched writers like this come and go. They all wanted to be paid for doing something they wanted to do instead of working on what they had been commissioned to do. This youngster really longed to write pessimistic sociological scripts about the doomed passions of young lovers in a materialistic, stagnating world. But he had to force himself to make money out of any kind of writing job he could get in order to support the wife he had acquired and the 2 children they had produced in some of his less doom-laden moments. While waiting for him to return, Robbie said to the casting director, "As a matter of interest, what do you find most frightening?" "Dealing with agents." "And what about you, Robbie?" said Irwin jovially. Come on, boy, Giff. What about your own custom-built nightmare? Robbie ought to have expected this at some time or other, but he was caught off balance. He glared. Erwin Hodek or no Erwin Hodek, he glared. Erwin gulped and forced a grin. Okay, he said. Sorry I asked. The writer came back. They all laughed like hell at his ashen face, and the discussion went on. Things shaped up well. The writer was sent home to get it all down on paper. Robbie set to work on some roughs. It was all so lucid in his head that he resented the time that would now have to be spent on detailed work, on wrangles with technicians, on the whole protracted business of getting the picture moving. Robbie thought with his eyes, and so far as he was concerned, the thinking was finished. The picture existed in his mind, complete and perfect. All the rest was at best routine, and at worst drudgery. In the middle of the third week, after Erwin had given the thumbs-up sign, Robbie had a visitor. He was lying on the couch with a book of engravings from an old manual of medieval tortures, contentedly sipping a glass of brandy, when the buzzer sounded. It was unusual for anyone to call on him in the late evening, unless specially invited. He went grudgingly to the door. Under the light stood a young man with shaggy hair, a blunt chin, broad shoulders, and a grubby raincoat. With no hint of a potential welcome, Robbie said, "Yes." The young man said, "I'm Doreen's brother." "Oh?" Robbie had not thought of Doreen for more than a week, and did not even have to feign indifference. "I didn't know she had a brother." "What have you done with her?" Robbie's neighbours had never disturbed him, and he had no wish to disturb them in the slightest degree. Quietness, seclusion, and near anonymity had suited him very well. He stood aside and waved the young man in. In the confidently individual style of Robbie's sitting room, the visitor looked a trifle less sure of himself. He wouldn't sit down and he wouldn't have a drink. He shifted his weight from one foot to another. Weighty but not dangerous, thought Robbie. "Where's Doreen?" "I'm afraid I have no idea." "She's been living with you?" "Until a few weeks ago, then she went away." "Where to?" "I told you, I simply do not know." The young man growled. "She didn't tell me she was thinking of leaving." "Perhaps she wasn't in the habit of confiding in you." "She told me everything." "Everything?" Rather indiscreet of her, and somewhat distasteful. "I want to know where she is. She wouldn't have disappeared without saying a word to me." "But that's precisely what she has done." The young man shook his head doggedly. He was vague, but stubborn. But still, Robbie was sure, not dangerous. He knew nothing and could prove nothing. "We met once a week, always, never missed." "She didn't tell me." Robbie kept it light. She was obviously a girl of many secrets. He gave this time to sink in, then moved a hint of a pace towards the door. Automatically the baffled young man turned, and then it was easy for Robbie to shepherd him to the front door. Outside in the mews there was a final protest. "I don't like it. There's something fishy about it." "It was never what you'd call a permanent arrangement, you know. If she told you everything, as you claim," said Robbie, with what he conceived to be the right flicker of disdain, "you must be well aware that the relationship was for, our mutual convenience. And now she has gone. If I ever find out—" But there was no way of finishing the sentence. Doreen's brother hadn't even a glimmering of what there might be to find out. He wavered for a moment, then stamped away over the cobbles. He wouldn't go to the police. He wouldn't do anything, because there was nothing to do. The picture gathered momentum. The girl, whom Erwin had fancied for the lead, was free at the right time after all. The production manager set up locations in the spring, and the weather was good. Shooting arrived, and the writer was paid off on the first day of shooting, and went home to write a bleak novel about corruption in the movie world. The rushes looked good. The first rough cut showed up a few holes, which Robbie plugged with some spontaneous grisly sequences. The next cut sent Erwin into ecstasies. "Fabulous! This is the greatest! After this, The distribution deal I could set up for the next one. Already there was a next one. They were talking about it, tossing gimmicks to and fro, when a local authority some 30 miles from London decided to clear an old car dump and encourage development of the reclaimed land. Robbie, like most people in the business, read nothing but trade papers, the Sunday critics, and material directly related to the job in hand. He therefore knew nothing of this clearance scheme until the doorman at the office mentioned it to Irwin's chauffeur, who told Irwin, who brought it up with relish at a story conference. Now there's a fantastic idea. It's made for us. All we have to do is figure out a motive. It's all there. By God, I'll say it's all there. A whole cache of bodies, or what's left of them, under a great heap of clapped-out automobiles. How did they get there? One guy, or several? And some of the things that happened to those corpses, man! Irwin raised his arms in gratitude to the gods for such a gift. The find had indeed been a spectacular one. There were the remains of a male body which had, according to the pathologist's findings, been hanged, drawn and quartered. There was another similar one where the subject appeared to have committed hara-kiri, or to have had a similar disemboweling forced upon him. A flayed, decomposing corpse of a young woman had been dumped on top of several dead dogs and cats, killed in various ways. There were other limbs and fragments marked in ways which the pathologist could not identify, or possibly was at this stage unwilling to publish. Robbie could have explained them all. There was one they didn't mention. He wondered if they had found it yet, the man on whom he had experimented for the sake of that Viking film Irwin had made, of Danish savagery, the chest ripped open and the rib cage forced open and outwards, set against the sinister background of the Suffolk coast. That had been quite a taut little thriller. Can you imagine the kind of guy who'd do that kind of thing? Raved Irwin exultantly. The casting director looked at Robbie and went pale. It looked as though he could, at a pinch, imagine the kind of guy. But Robbie doubted that he would ever come out and say anything about it. On the way home that evening he didn't hum, and he wasn't altogether happy, but neither was he unduly worried. There was nothing to lead the police or anyone else to him. Just that if some little thing went wrong, some fidgety little rumour started, it could be annoying for a while. He put his key in the front door and walked in, and a bulky shadow launched itself abruptly from the far side of the mews, charged against him, and hurled him along the passage. What the hell? Doreen's brother manhandled him into the sitting room with one large meaty hand. In the other hand he swung a small black bag. Robbie tried still to keep it light as ever. He had nothing to fear. Nobody could prove a thing. He said, "You look like a plumber or a doctor with his little black bag." "A doctor," said the young man. "I didn't know." "You're always telling me a lot of things you don't know," said the young man. "And actually," his hand was clamped on Robbie's arm, "there are plenty of things I don't know, even as a doctor. Haven't finished my training yet. I've got a lot to learn. Haven't we all? A real professional never stops learning." "Experiment helps. Isn't that so? Experiment," said Doreen's brother furiously, and his arm went back and swung forward and knocked Robbie into a corner. Robbie whimpered. Before he could scramble to his feet, the young man had whipped a length of rope round him and fastened his wrists painfully behind his back. "You can't—" A grubby cloth was stuffed into his mouth. Robbie lay on the floor struggling impotently, while the young man prowled through the house. His footsteps receded, came back, went away again. Robbie heard him trying various doors, heard him rattle at the workroom door. He came back and probed into Robbie's pockets. When he had found the keys, he set off again. Robbie heard the workroom door open. There was a long pause. Then the young man came back again. He stood over Robbie and looked down at him. "I think I can guess now what you did to Doreen." Robbie tried to mumble through his gag, but the young man had no intention of listening. Yes, it's pretty clear. He hauled Robbie to his feet and shook him slowly, incredulously. You've got a diseased mind. You know that? A diseased mind. And your eyes, they're not so healthy. He began to propel Robbie, stumbling along the passage. The workroom door was open. The light was on. They lurched into the room. Robbie heard the door slam behind them, and then his legs were kicked away from under him, and he was swung dexterously up onto the bench. There's no way of bringing Doreen back, but I'm an old-fashioned type. An eye for an eye. The young man laughed harshly. That's so appropriate. Robbie began to sweat. It couldn't be true. It was coincidence. This young fool couldn't possibly know. Couldn't mean what those words might just possibly hideously have meant. She told me everything, said Doreen's brother. Told me you talked in your sleep, Mr. Senage. That's a nasty nightmare you keep having. There was a click of a catch. Robbie knew that he was opening his bag. And still he wasn't going to believe. He wasn't. The nightmare couldn't come true. On film, in the mind, yes, all things were possible, but not really, not here and now. I'm going to give you a local anaesthetic. Not to save you pain. You can have the pain later, and welcome to it. But without an anaesthetic you might pass out, and that would never do. I want you to be conscious of exactly what's happening. No, said Robbie inside his head. No, he screamed without a sound coming out. He closed his eyes, but the young man's hard fingers forced them open, and there was a jab of a hypodermic, and something cold and metallic was forced into place, and he couldn't close his eyes. A slow numbness crept over them. The young man leaned forward. There was a flash of steel under the light. Before your very eyes, said Doreen's brother. Not true, not true, not true. It had to be just another nightmare, like all the others. Soon he would lash out with one foot and kick the blankets away, and he would be sweating in his own bed. Not stretched out on this bench with the cold moisture running down his forehead and over his nose. So proud of your eyes, said the steady, ugly voice. A voice so like Doreen's. So acute, so sensitive. I'm told you have the reputation of thinking with your eyes. Doreen told me how you worried about them. That dream. King Lear. Oedipus. The lot. And the pain. But this won't hurt. Not right away. Robbie tried to kick out with one foot. If you wriggle, said the young man, I shall make a real mess of it, I'm afraid. He bent closer and the blade shone again in the light. You know, I haven't finished my training. I'm going to be awfully clumsy as it is. But there's one consolation. The blade was less than half an inch from Robbie's left eye, quite obscuring his vision now. When they find you, said Doreen's brother, think of the really fabulous idea it'll give your Mr. Hodek for his next picture. The blade descended.